What kind of world do we want for them? A girl born today will live in an unequal society, where she is likely to face more economic, social, mental, and physical hardships than boys as she grows up. In school, she may be discouraged to take classes that are not for girls. She may be one of the 12 million girls each year who are married before she turns 18. She might only make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes for doing the same job. She might even be pressured to choose between having a career or having children. And laws might not fully protect her right to a safe and healthy work environment. She might be 1 in 4 women who will experience gender-based violence. In most cases, the perpetrator will not be a stranger, but a partner, a family member, a friend, or a neighbor. Asia hosts the largest number of women and girls killed by their intimate partner. What if we can change all of that? Imagine being born into a world where girls know they can achieve anything and they can shape their own dreams. A world where no one will stop her from getting an education because there are no limits to what she can achieve. She will be fairly compensated and will work among colleagues who respect her contributions. She will have a seat at the table, break glass ceilings, and open doors for other women to follow. She won't have to choose between a career and a family because she can have both if she wants, when she wants. She will live a life free from violence because that is her fundamental right. She will live in a world where she is valued without discrimination and bias. This alternative future is possible. The world has made progress on gender equality, yet it will still take 270 years to close the gender pay gap. 270 years is too long. Today, as we face a pandemic and a climate crisis, we have the opportunity to construct a different future for women and girls and shape the future for all of us and the planet. ADB is committed to accelerating gender equality in the Asia and Pacific region. We support and engage women so they may fully benefit from everything we do, to help girls realize that anything is possible, to support women to be able to enjoy decent work and break into fields where they have been excluded in the past, to support women's access to food, water, to everything our planet offers, and lead on climate change action, and to be agents of change in their communities. Because when women thrive, all of humanity thrives. We at ADB are working to transform women's lives. Will you join us?
Morning and good afternoon. A very warm welcome to all of you that have joined us here again today. I see we have a number of people trickling in. Great to see so many familiar names and faces again today. I am Marcela Lucas, and I will be your moderator and host for today's workshop, Session 2 of the Investing in Women, Advancing the Transformative Gender Agenda in Central and West Asia in a post-COVID environment. A very warm welcome. If we could get the slides, please. Great, thank you. Today, we will start with a recap of yesterday's deep dive discussions. We heard a lot of very interesting information, and so we will start with hearing 3 presentations that will summarize each of the 3 thematic groups, providing a snapshot of the innovative approaches that you have identified or experienced to be successful. The bulk of today's workshop will look at unconscious gender bias in gender responsive programming and project implementation. At the end of today, as we close our 2-day workshop, we will conclude with closing remarks. Now, can I check you are all with me? If your camera's on, can you give me a thumbs up? Maybe a hello, good morning in the chat box or one of the virtual reactions. Fabulous. I see
Morning. We are hear you clearly.
Good morning, Ida. Very nice to see you all. Thank you so much. Good morning. We've got about 75 people with us. I think the numbers will increase. If you don't mind just keeping your microphone on mute, just so we don't have any background noise, that would be very helpful. Feel free to keep your camera on. I know that I and also the team love to see your faces, love to see your reactions, so we're not just speaking into a digital black hole. Great. All right, so throughout today, I would like to invite you to post any questions you might have. So you might still have questions from some of the discussions, from the study, from what some of the speakers shared about yesterday. Feel free to pop those into the chat box. And of course, you might have more questions that come up today as we go through the workshop. What we will do is we will try to answer those questions directly in the chat box, or we may actually create the response and share those either on the event page or in an email after the event, so everyone has access to the question and also to the responses. Okay, so feel free to pop your questions in the chat box. Up next, what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite one facilitator to summarize the discussions that we had yesterday. Uzma Altaf, may I hand it over to you to present on livelihoods and work, including entrepreneurship, agriculture, and migration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcela. Good morning, participants. Our theme for group discussion was impactful approaches addressing livelihoods and work. We had 3 group discussions led by Tahira, Gladys, and myself. The approaches which have worked well for different countries are listed here. For example, capacity building of financial services providers and digital financial literacy programs worked well for Uzbekistan. Creating supply chain and logistics support for women-owned SMEs. This has really worked well for Uzbekistan, where women were provided by different kind of support, starting from production, sales, marketing. So women-owned SMEs, there was improvement in the revenue and the skills of the women-owned SMEs. Kyrgyz Republic has been successful in launching a mentorship program for women entrepreneurs where they paired up rural women entrepreneurs with the SME representatives for 1 year, and this has resulted into improved business skills of women. Then use of social media for inspiring women in Kyrgyz Republic also worked well. And there has been discussions and recommendations that women image as empowered women needs to be highlighted and emphasized through different media channels to bring in more women role models. Increase women's access to higher skilled and non-traditional areas has been successful in Pakistan, where two electricity distribution companies are currently carrying out human resource development assessment of both men and women. And based on that assessment findings, there will be scholarship programs, internship programs for women, because there's a lower recruitment rate in electricity distribution companies. So this project will give women access to more jobs in non-traditional areas. And then inclusion of vulnerable groups. This was recommended as a cross-cutting approach. This is actually being integrated by ADB in all its operation, but participants highlighted that this should be the cross-cutting approach in all the operations and investments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Uzma. It sounds like all three of you had some very in-depth and interesting conversations. I love how you've highlighted some of these key projects, and it's quite clear to see that the learnings from these could, like you say, cut across different types of projects, different industries, and of course, across countries. Thank you so much. I'd like to now hand it over to Lucini Sahumia. If you could please share your summary findings on the unpaid care and domestic work discussions.
Thank you, Marcela. Thank you, dear participants, honorable guests. Thank you for your participation in breakout rooms discussions and your invaluable contribution. Let me drive you through the summary of discussion on unpaid care and domestic work. Through the discussions, the widespread nature of the issue was pointed out by the participants all over the Western and Central Asian countries. The following highlights have been drawn from the discussions. Advanced legislation on unpaid care and domestic work. Examples brought up by representatives from Azerbaijan and Tajikistan point out the essential impact legislative amendments may have on recognition of unpaid care and domestic work, suggesting respective mechanisms to acknowledge and support those, particularly women, undertaking unpaid care and domestic work. Public awareness raising on unpaid care and domestic work. Along with official status and recognition, unpaid care and domestic work should get publicized. Social and traditional media are used and should be continuously used to broaden the discourse on the issue and raise awareness of public, which may eventually lead to recognition of unpaid care and domestic work. Gendered evidence generation and implication to policies. Recalling the research presented by Emilia Rossi, as well as credits given by the participants and panelists to the data-driven approaches to address the impact of COVID-19, discussions highlighted once again the vital importance to generate evidence and data which will be gender responsive and will be applied to the state policy making. Supporting mechanisms for vulnerable groups of women. Vulnerable groups of women challenged by COVID-19 require specific to their conditions support which should be based on evidence generated through intersectional research. In Kyrgyz Republic, for example, the state pays for personal assistant to support in the care of children with disabilities, and therefore lightening the burden of unpaid care on mothers. And finally, in intensive support to education of women and girls. Recalling Senator Gulnora Marufova, support to education of women and girls especially in the conditions that brought up COVID-19. Education is a driving power to progress, and therefore it should be highlighted, especially and supported by the governments intensively. Education is a key to open wider doors. Thank you very much. That's it from our three groups, led by me, Fazilat, and Zulfiya.
Great, thank you so much for sharing, Lucini. And as we were discussing yesterday, again, a lot of overlap also with the livelihoods and the gender-based violence. So lots of cross-cutting and knowledge sharing there. Thank you so much. Could I now please ask Gulfiya Abdulleva to share your findings and your peers' findings on the gender-based violence and access to essential health services?
Good morning, good afternoon, dear participants. Thank you for your active participation in our discussions yesterday, and I hope we will have active your participation today as well. Since we have significant share of participants who are Russian speaking, I'd like to speak in Russian, since we have a translation anyway. Дорогие участники, вчера мы вопросы гендерного насилия, доступа к услугам здравоохранения обсуждали в 3 группах. Эти 3 группы велись Эмилией, Гульнорой и мной. И вот сегодня мы хотели вам представить основные эффективные подходы, которые мы определили с нашими участниками. Хотелось бы остановиться на примере мобильных групп, о которых вчера говорила Зульфия Кочербаева. Мобильная группа представляется таким очень интересным инструментом, где оказывается комплексная помощь жертвам семейного насилия. Как только получается информация о происходящем гендерном насилии, то уже комплексная группа, полиция, социальные работники, службы защиты детей, а также работники кризисного центра выезжают на место и сразу могут оказать комплексную помощь. Это очень такой интересный пример. Следующее. Горячие линии для жертв гендерного насилия. Горячие линии присутствуют в разной форме в разных странах, но здесь горячие линии именно для жертв гендерного насилия. То есть непосредственно целевая группа. Да? И эти горячие линии, они, вот мы слышали примеры в Узбекистане и Кыргызстане, жертвы гендерного насилия могли позвонить на горячую линию, которая бесплатная, и они могли получить психологическую, юридическую помощь. При этом информация о происходящем насилии передается в соответствующие правоохранительные органы социальной защиты. Тоже интересный механизм. Мы вчера обнаружили, что частный сектор, это вот, например, коллег из Грузии, из частного сектора, они рассказывали, что проводили обучающие мероприятия для своих клиентов и для своих сотрудников в части тренинги по балансу работы личной жизни, управления стрессом, лидерские навыки, навыки переговоров. И мне показалось, что очень часто мы больше задумываемся о том, что частный сектор тоже может играть значительную роль в расширении прав и возможностей женщин. В части, например, повышения осведомленности. Работая с частным сектором можно выйти на более широкую аудиторию. Вот, мне кажется, нужно этот пример тоже взять на учет. И последнее. У нас есть очень много донорских проектов, инвестиционных проектов в наших странах, и проведение таких, как минимум, мероприятий о повышении осведомленности тех, кто работает в этих проектах. Да, вот, например, конкретный пример транспортного проекта. Коллеги из Пакистана об этом говорили, Узбекистан об этом говорил. Я знаю, что в Кыргызстане тоже в транспортном проекте есть компонент обучения персонала транспортных управлений, транспортных предприятий о гендерном насилии и как, например, реагировать в таких вот случаях. В заключение я хотела сказать, что для того, чтобы решать проблемы гендерного насилия, мы видим, что у нас акторы с различных секторов могут и должны вовлекаться. Например, у нас есть примеры вовлечения, понятно, государственные органы, организации гражданского общества. Вот мы видим, что частный сектор может играть значительную роль. Ну и также сами донорские проекты, инвестиционные проекты, они тоже, в них тоже можно проводить эффективную работу. Спасибо большое. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gothia. I think that's fabulous. I think what I'm seeing across all three themes that you're also highlighting here are two things. One, mobilization of resources that already exist. And I know we were discussing these were temporarily put into place because COVID has really restricted our movement, but in the hopes that these might become permanent. And in so, hopefully provide greater and better services for the women and children, and sometimes men that are victims of gender-based violence. And the other thing that you really draw out here is the key importance of private sector. And that's why we're so delighted to have all of you here with us today. We have representatives from government agencies, civil society, NGO, and private sector, and of course, our colleagues from ADB. But it's only when we all come together that we can really create the impact and then scale that impact. So thank you very much to Uzma Lusini Golfia for presenting on behalf of your colleagues and on behalf of all of the participants yesterday. Thank you so much for your inputs. So we started off with a summary of the deep dive discussions because yesterday we really, if I can take you through our journey, we looked at the issues, right? In the study, we identified the issues that have arisen because of COVID-19 and the gender divide that has become bigger. We then looked at, well, what are some of the approaches that have been happening on the ground that have been successful, that were scalable, and that we could then test in other projects, programs, and countries. And so today, we really want to look at a key issue that still hinders successful execution and implementation. And so I would like to introduce you to our main facilitator for today. Dr. Jane Horan is the founder of the Horan Group. She has extensive experience working with multilateral banks, government agencies, and multinational companies, specifically in unconscious bias and building inclusive spaces, including work spaces. Her doctorate degree specifically focused on leadership and education, and we're hearing that educational theme coming up again and again, with a focus on gender in the Asia Pacific and Middle East regions. Without further ado, Jane, may I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Marcella. Thank you so much for the opening remarks. And I want to thank all the participants for being here. Let me just get my slides set up and I'll get started right away. Let me do the full screen. Yeah, so thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here and I'm honored to be here with such a group. I spent the time listening yesterday to the focus on gender equality. And just like Marcella said, what might get in our way? We're going to talk about that right now. This session is going to be a little bit different than perhaps your sessions yesterday. It's a learning session. So I want to spark your thinking. I want to engage you in a conversation, trigger some questions. We're going to use Mentimeter. We're going to use chat function. And I want to talk about how we move forward with gender equality. And I'm going to look at the intersection of culture and gender in this presentation on unconscious bias, one of my absolutely favorite topics for gender equality. So let's just, one of the things that IWD, the theme this year is breaking the bias, but to break the bias, we kind of have to understand, well, what is bias and what are we talking about? So in our session today, I'm going to show you what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on defining it. I'm going to ask you right away, what does it mean to you? Then we're going to touch on, well, where does this come from? Is it just out of space, the other person, or is it within us where bias comes from? Is it in our brains? What's the origins of bias? Also want to look at, really importantly, the impact at work. And this is where I am going to focus very deeply on gender and multicultural. And I'm also going to bring in some research that I did in the Asia Pacific region and the Middle East. There we go. It's going to talk about a bias that I did research with women in Asia Pacific and the Middle East. So I'm going to do a little mini case study with you. Then we're going to talk about why inclusion matters. I mean, we're all here. We want to be inclusive. Actually, what we're doing right now is inclusive. But what's the impact on your organization's inclusion? And why should we even be concerned about this? And I'm going to show you some quantitative data why it's so important. And last, I don't want to leave you talking about bias and then say, well, so what? What do we do? I am going to give you 4 steps, and I'm going to give you some questions to ask one another that you can start doing right away. So that's what our session looks like. And we are now going to jump right into Mentimeter. Let me just, we're going to jump into Mentimeter and have you answer this question. What does bias mean to you? And when I ask that question, it could be just one word, your gut reaction. It could also be, is it positive or negative? What are you thinking about it? Oh, yeah. Be good if we went to Mentimeter. Inequality, prejudice, marginalization, discrimination. Yeah, this is leaning towards, you could actually, if you want to say it's negative or it's positive or it's someplace in between, whatever your gut reaction is. Prejudice, exclusion, marginalization, negativity. We're going to wait for a few more because I know it took us time to get onto Mentimeter. So I'd love to just kind of encourage you, just gut reaction. What does bias mean to you, or what's your association with it? Preferences, absolutely. Preconception, definitely. You're hitting on all pre-existing. Lens, oh my gosh, exclusion, benefits one group. Yep. Mostly negative. Wonderful. Marginalization, assumptions. Fabulous. So I think these are really wonderful, and I want to hold on to them. We can hold on to them for the remainder of the session. I'm sure that Marcella and the team will have that. But let me just shift back now to kind of, I'm going to pull on a lot of your definitions that you said and bring it back to what I uncovered in looking at this topic on unconscious bias. So first of all, I think it's good to get grounded in a definition, because as you can see, we all come at it with very different flavors of what unconscious bias or bias is. So unconscious biases, I'm going to walk you through this definition. Unconscious bias is a bias that we are unaware of. It happens outside of our control. It's really an automatic reaction, and it's triggered by a brain function making quick decisions, assessments about people and situations, and it's influenced by our background, cultural environment, personal experiences. So this is where it comes from. Like, this is comes from our background. And this is, if we're happy with this decision, I want to talk about, this is what we're going to use for it. Many times it's very much out of our control, not intentional at all. I'm having a little bit of a problem with my slide. My slide's not moving forward, sorry. Oh, here we go, yes. So let's so what I want to do is pull out one area that I thought that you saw on that, which was automatic reactions. And we're going to use chat this time. And what I'm going to show you is a picture. And I just want you to just put into chat what you see in this picture. What's coming up for you? What do you see? Horses. Snow, horses, absolutely. Love this. Land, yep. Snow, horses and snow, horses, yes. So let me just throw another question out to you. How many horses do you see there? Snow and land. 4, 5, 6, 5, 5, 4. Oh, I love this. The numbers are coming quicker and faster. Maybe I should just do questions on numbers. It's a very analytical group here. Love this. 5 horses in snowy mountains. Okay, Nino, you nailed it. It is exactly that. Now there's going to be, I'm going to explain why I put this up here. 4 visible, but there actually is 5, and this is an optical illusion. Let me take you through one more thing. Again, keep the chat going because I'm going to ask you one more question. This is an automatic reaction. I just want your gut feel. When you see the next slide, tell me what you read on that slide. Ice cream is good. Alice, Kai, Nabila. Oh my God, this is like less than 2 or 3 seconds, right? You're just all putting this in. Ice cream is good. Ice cream is cool. I love that. Ice cream is good. Ice cream is good. Fabulous. So now let me show you what it really says. Here's the real response. Doesn't say ice cream is good as all. Why did we start this way? Why did we start out an unconscious bias session looking at this? This is exactly related to automatic reactions. It actually is mental shortcuts and quick judgments. And I'm going to unpack this for you, looking at neuroscience and other areas. I just ask you, what pictures do you see there? And you automatically respond as horses, snow, what? And I said, what's there? You had no context for that, right? This happens to us every day at work. Make that decision. Who are we going to give that mentoring to? Who are we going to give supply chain and logistics to? Come on, we need to get this done quickly. I know you've thought about it a lot. Let's give this project to that person. Quick judgments, right? And the other one is that our quick judgments lead to blind spots. Ice cream is good is the best one for me to tell you is that I gave you very little information. I said, just tell me what you see on that slide. Really, honestly, that was about 5 seconds when you all started responding. Think about every day at work, these quick judgments, they could lead to blind spots that we don't see the talent in front of us. We don't see we don't get all the information and we quickly make a decision. This is bias. And what I also want to do is to say to you, bias is sometimes not, it can be negative and it can be positive. It's actually very much a part of our brain. So it's hard for us to stop it. It's actually built into us and we need it. So I'm going to show you both sides of bias. And I think some of you said that on the Mentimeter. It's when we pick one group over another when it becomes negative. But what I want to show you is a lot of times we don't realize that we're doing that. So I'm going to take you through a few more visuals here, and then we're going to unpack a lot of the visuals that we're talking about. I've got a series of pictures here, and I'd love for you to just kind of glance at those pictures. And I'm going to ask you a question, and at the end of the question, we're going to put this into Mentimeter at the end of all the pictures showing up. So lots of beautiful pictures. My question for you is, what words come to mind when you see these pictures? And I do want to shift over to Mentimeter if that's okay. What words come to mind when you see these pictures? Just perfect. Thank you. We've got a lot putting them in chat, which is fine. Perfect. I can read them out. Artists, guitarists, music, nations and their music. Yes, some said poverty. Thank you for that. Yep, thank you for that. To make a happy life, poverty, they're happy, nations music, wonderful. Street theater, absolutely. Just keep them coming. These are wonderful, wonderful words. Work, yep. I'm going to let you put a few to spear happiness, performance. There's a Russian one, if one of the interpreters wouldn't mind reading that out. Unhappiness and the need to make your life. Yep. Wonderful. Freedom. Love that, Camilla. Freedom. Yes, these are beautiful words. Well-being. Absolutely. Freedom and well-being. Yep. Really nice. Great. So I'm going to switch back now to our presentation. Freedom is good choice, and show you the research on this, because so the research, so this is a piece of research, it was a global piece of research, and it came from the University of Chicago, but they went around the world showing similar pictures and asking the same questions. And a lot of your responses responded in the same, you're going to see the same ones. So people started out with, oh, talent and entertaining, and the same with you, as some people said musical instruments, saxophone, passionate, there was freedom, travel, culture. But also some people did say some of the words that you said: poor, poverty, mentally deranged, crazy. Some people only saw boys, and definitely in that presentation or those pictures were women, right? So this is a global study, and it was actually looking at bias. How do we see the world? We see normal pictures that we all recognize, and we interpret this differently. So here's the question that I always ask is, if we, and again, I only gave you a few minutes to look at that and get your gut reaction, and that's what the research did too. Who might we be missing? When we talked about ice cream is good, and I showed you the real one, who might we be missing when we're giving out projects, when we're loaning money to different groups, when we are trying to ensure that we have the right people on projects? This is a very famous story. He was in the middle of all the pictures about one of the best violinists in the world that was standing on a street corner. And a lot of people thought he was homeless or poor. And it ended up being one of the most famous violinists in the world, who actually the night before performed to a sold out theater. So when we don't see people the way we think we should, this is when we can get, and we do quick thinking, this is when bias is in action, right? So let me take you now through a little bit, like I said, where does it come from? What's the origin? Well, bias comes from how we see the world. Bias is, we may have grown up with street musicians. We may have grown up with street musicians making their life from that. Could be a freedom of choice. We may have grown up with street musicians that were looking for money, and that's how they did survive. So whatever we saw, whatever we've seen in our lives, this is how we start to make decisions. And we carry this to work. It's not like we leave that baggage at home. All of this comes to us when we start making decisions about work and who gets what projects. So let's just unpack where this comes from a little bit more. It comes from our multiple identities. None of us, and this is why diversity and inclusion is so rich and so wonderful, because none of us are just one from one place. Yes, you can tell that I'm from North America, but the culture and subculture underneath me and all of you is quite different. I have an American voice. I lived half of my life in Asia, studied in China, grew up with grandparents who came from Ireland. So culture and subcultures all miss. Yes, my home of origin is the US, but most of my life has been in the Asia Pacific region. Institution, where you work, right? Do I work at the ADB? Do I work at the government ministry in Uzbekistan? Do I work at an embassy in Myanmar? Where did I choose to work? And my educational background. All of that makes up my identity. Then next we also have is our individual and life experiences, real world encounters, books and stories and movie and media. All of this we bring to work every day, and we don't stop to think about it. And I'm not saying you should stop to unpack all of the complexities of self. But what I am saying is we have to be aware when our triggers and we're making quick decisions about people or projects or who we're going to work with, that this is where these filters and where where we come from might carry bias with us. And again, not negative, it just is. So let's look at what I thought was fascinating when you put the words up there. And again, none of your words were wrong. It's just, it also looks at how we look at words. And I am going to talk about how words don't translate equally across culture, because we're a rich multicultural group here. Where does bias, and figure out where bias, what role does bias play? So when you put it up, there was, we saw it and kind of viewed it as more, not so positive, but there's a reason why we need bias. And I'm going to explain where it comes from. One, you might be really familiar with this one, is imagine this. We get 34 gigabytes of information in one day. 34 gigabytes and 100,000 words. If we just look at what's going on here, I'm on video speaking to you. There is a presentation that you're reading. We're both having English and Russian translation. We're doing chat, we're doing Mentimeter. Some of you may be looking at your phone. Some of you may be looking at your computer. All of this information you're getting every day. Think about your daily work. You're doing your phones. You might be doing social media. You might be reading reports. You may be talking to people inside your organization. You may be concerned about your family. All of this comes together. We can't possibly make decisions unless we start filtering things out. And this is the role that bias plays from a positive perspective, what we're going to call out when it becomes not so positive. So what happens is bias helps you make sense of the world. Back to my ice cream. I showed you so little in that slide, and you read it instantly. Even if you just instantly read it, that was, like I said, 10 seconds. It helps you make meaning. We need bias to make meaning in the world. Efficient. If your boss or your team comes to you and say, we need to make a decision on that right away, you're forced to make a decision. You can't possibly keep going back to say, I'm making this decision for my culture, am I making this decision for my education? You can't slow it down completely. You just have to be efficient and make some decisions. The third piece, which many of you probably know about, is its survival. Bias is our fight or flight. This goes back to when we were living in caves, and when a new member came to our community, what we would do is either push back, run away, or push forward and fight. So bias is a natural function in our brain. And this is what it does for us. It helps us make meaning, be efficient, and survival. Let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience part of it, because this is the fascinating part. And this is what I also want to tell you about, that it doesn't, it helps us think about that negative or positive part. If it's deeply embedded in our brains, we all come to work wanting to be inclusive and work with a diverse community and support and help others. We don't come to work thinking, oh, I'm going to intentionally exclude that person. So it's our natural proclivity to do that. So we're going to show how kind of the natural brain function might get in our way. And this is actually a beautiful piece of research, and I'm certain all of you have heard or read about this. It's Daniel Kahneman's work. Daniel Kahneman looked at the psychology of making decisions and choices. And what Kahneman found was we've got two sides of our brain. He called it system one. System one is automatic, associations, impulsive, stereotyping. Look at this picture, give me an answer. Give me an answer to this. Automatic, impulsive, but that side of our brain also holds stereotypes of what I feel about a person or what I remember, associations about a person, right? if you think about that horse slide I showed you, if I came back a year from now, every single one of you, if I said, what's there, you'd say horse and 5. You would automatically know. It's deeply embedded in your psyche now. The first time I showed it to you, you had no context of what that was all about. The other side of our brain is systems 2 thinking. And this is conscious, rational, it carries empathy. It takes us a little bit longer. Let me think through that process. Maybe let me look at some more data on it. And so to experience this, I'm going to walk you through a short little scenario that I think you might understand implicitly, just to feel what this is like, right? So remember, system 1 is stereotyping. System 2 holds our empathy and takes us a little bit longer. So here's one for you. And I'm going to use the ADB as an example because I'm fortunate to be able to spend some time with the ADB. So I'm driving to the ADB office and I'm on ADB Avenue in Manila. And I'm driving my car and maybe I have some colleagues in the car with me. And you know what the traffic is like in any big city, pretty busy, and you have to be very aware. So all of a sudden, somebody pulls in front of me and slams on their brakes, right? Am I going to do system 2 thinking and say, wonder what that red marker means on that car? What should I do here? If I use that type of thinking, I'd be in the back seat of the other car and I'd be in an accident, right? So you can see system 1 and system 2. Now, system 1 is automatic reaction. I'm probably going to use my muscle memory and hold my hand out like this so I protect somebody sitting in the seat next to me. Even if there's nobody in that seat next to me, I'm still going to do it because that's my muscle memory. And if I had been in an accident before, all of those feelings are going to come up for me. That's my impulsive, that's my associations, that's my stereotype. And let me add to it, I might scream and yell at the person who slammed on their brakes. So we do need system 1, and we also need system 2. So what I want to ask you right now to put into chat is, what one do you think we use more often? Do we use system 1 or do we use system 2? Just in chat, 1 or 2, 1 or 2. System 1 most of the time, Zara, thank you. System 1 more often, 1 more often. 2, Sena, it'd be great to get your insights at the end of the session on 2. And Charos, system 1, mostly 2. I love that, Zahida. System 1, depends on, somebody said it depends on I have to go back to that. Depends on how the driver is men or women. Elaine, that's funny. System 1, it depends on the person's experience. That's an interesting response, Farida. Like that. System 1, system 2, both. Nicole, both. 2. Sophia, yes, yeah. So why I'm calling your attention to the neurosciences? I want to depend on the mood. Absolutely, or it depends on how much pressure you have to make those decisions, right? If you have to make a snappy decision, chances are you're going to go with system 1. These are some great answers here, Javier. I looked at that too. I just think what wonderful answers. So the reason why I pull this up, Charmin, great, mostly 1, brain usually thinks based on information it gets, or brain also usually thinks on systemation when we remember, right? And we remember, oh, that person did this to me, or depends on the situation, yes. So I bring this up because this is to explain to you, to kind of see both sides of bias. Bias is negative when we pick one group over another, but bias is what we need for life. It actually helps us make decisions. And we are creatures of comfort, so 1 for sure, absolutely, Kai. And the thing about it is we have to remember when we're doing 1, like, oh, that was a trigger, that was an automatic reaction. And I'm going to talk you through, I'm going to bring this now to work and say, do you see when this happens at work? And I'm going to show you some areas where we do use system 1, and we should probably be spending a little bit more time on system 2. So thank you for participating in this. This is fun. I love all the responses, and I hope just, sometimes when you get a laugh out of things, you learn a lot more when you laugh. So let's move over to the impact at work. And I'm going to walk you through some mini case studies. I'm going to share with you some of my biggest mistakes in my doctoral research, which led to my greatest insights on unconscious bias, specifically in Asia Pacific and the Middle East. And I'll explain the dynamics and the stories around that. So what I found is that unconscious bias it impacts every single aspect of work, whether it starts with before the person joins the company, when they send a resume, to how we welcome people to onboard them, right? That onboarding that might take 6 months to get to, or, and I understand that our organizations are really busy. Imagine that 6 months with somebody new and not feeling part of the organization. Who gets development? I heard on one of the very beginning of the slides, we were talking about feedback on mentoring, which is really important. How do we decide who gets mentoring, right? Is it this group? Is it this group? What I want to do is have a conversation and trigger some thinking that maybe when you go back to your office, you're like, oh, maybe I should rethink that strategy on what I'm doing. Then who do we decide who's a talent? And this is the area, talent and leadership, where I found that impacts women the most. And it comes from perhaps a biased look at what leadership looks like. It could become our preference for one style of leadership over the other. And again, unintentional, unless we're able to have those conversations with people. So let me just walk you through on what I've learned in the 2 areas I want to call out, because these, I'm actually going to throw this out to this group. This is where I find one of the biggest challenges with and opportunities for women at work, whether it be in a multilateral bank, whether it be at a government agency or ministry. We always talk about women falling, leaving work, leaving the organization at a certain period, management or director level, whatever. I actually think it has a lot to do with this area. And I think we could intervene in these areas and ensure we have that rich diversity at work. So in my research, I studied transformational leadership, and I purposely picked transformational leadership because it is a leadership that has ethics and values. I also found some fascinating facts where women scored higher on, so it's a leadership framework that is both for men and women. I don't want to say that men and women are different in leadership. Maybe the way our style is, or maybe the way we lead might be, but actually there's no quantitative data that separates men and women in leadership. This is a beautiful style of leadership that drives values and ethics and change. Been around since 40 years. James McGregor Burns wrote the seminal book on transformational leadership. And 40 years ago, he said, leadership is the most complicated phenomenon in the world. Now imagine that 40 years ago to where we are today: multicultural, multi-generational, hopefully gender equality in leadership by the end of, maybe by the end of this year, 2022. And look at what's happening in our world: COVID, work from home, hybrid, a lot of other things going on in our world that we can't deny that's happening, some conflict in certain areas, right? This is taking its toll on leadership, and it's very hard to define what a leadership is and what a leadership isn't. So I'm going to bring you through a cross-cultural aspect of leadership. I'm going to make it really binary, just to give you an example of where I see bias and where I see opportunities for all of us to stop and question who's a leader and who isn't a leader. so let me take you through. So I'm using Erin Meyer's work on the cultural map. This is research-based culture dimensions. And we're going to look at leadership. We're going to look at leadership right here. So on the hierarchy map, so not on the hierarchy, on the map of cultural dimensions, and many of you who've worked multicultural groups, you've probably seen this before, but let's just take it from these two sides. One is a hierarchical style of leadership, and the other one is a leadership that is more egalitarian. So if we look at one side, and they're both okay, like there's nothing wrong with either one of them, they both serve a purpose. So hierarchy is somebody who leads from the front and somebody who has command and control, and the same command and control and communication style. From a hierarchical leadership perspective, there's a power distance, right? So I'm a leader at the top, and my direct reports there's a substantial distance between us and them, me and them. Egalitarian is a little bit different. Egalitarian is when we lead from the center and our teams are around us, our boards around us, our families around us. And communication style is not command and control. I'd be skip level meetings. I'm going to speak, I'm going to talk to the person I just met coming in and ask them how it's doing. I'm going to talk to my team. It's going to be all over. And I'm going to have that expectation of my team. Herein lies the bias that I found inside organizations. If you're working for an egalitarian style of leadership, and I've worked with women in these organizations, typically this is where I spend most of my time consulting to organizations on leadership frameworks and how we decide who's a leader. I've had where women will ask questions and they might be too direct in their question to that hierarchical leader. They might be challenged. Well, why are we doing this? Why are we writing up this policy this way? It could impact the people in this country. Let's think more holistically, not just being assertive, but in this style, they may be deemed as aggressive, right? Labeled. Again, I think the labeling part is very important to look at unconscious bias. The other side, egalitarian, where somebody's a bit more reserved, more quiet. I'm not going to be forthcoming with what I think about that policy. I'm going to wait till my boss or my leaders ask me a question. That person can be seen as not certain, maybe not have confidence, maybe weak. What I'm calling out for you are the labels that I've heard inside organization. She's too aggressive or she's too weak. Not necessarily. Both of the people I'm telling you about were phenomenal leaders, delivered year on year what they were supposed to, papers, helped communities, all of that. But it was this style difference that impacted leadership. And then it went from, I'm not so certain if we can move them up to the next level. It started impacting promotions. And this is where I think it's all of us just collectively start having a conversation with people who are making those decisions, whether it be bosses or whatever, on who's a leader and who isn't. It comes from our background. I see this person as a leader. I might not see the other person as a leader. Let me take this one step further for you, and I'm going to use a little mini case study here. I'm going to make it, I'm not going to say the embassy. I was working in an embassy, but it was in Myanmar. And I want to explain this to you and see if this resonates with you. And then we'll have some more discussions on the impact on unconscious bias. So the communication one is the one that I found. So I have a background in cross-cultural development. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I moved to China about 25 years ago and saw this firsthand, the very different styles of communication from sort of East-West communication styles, right? And so what I found is I was in Myanmar and I was working at an embassy there. And so I'm going to give you the cultural background on this, and I'm just to give us a framework of reference. So in the embassy, they hired a local, really great talent woman from Myanmar to run a project for them in the northern part of the country. And she was described as a humble, servant leader. What an absolutely powerful, positive description for somebody, right? And they really thought she was great, but they called me in and they said, she's a little too quiet. And our, the head of the embassy and the head of the country is saying, do you think she will be able to deal with the other agencies we're working with? Because they could be quite tough and quite direct in their communication style. And she is a bit, well, she's just a bit quiet. And we're not so certain if she has the presence. Now, the problem that I have with this word presence is it's culturally loaded, right? So presence in Japan is very different than presence in Mumbai, which is very different than presence in Manila, very different than probably Uzbekistan, right? So presence is a cultural context, and it's not, I don't find it very, we never get underneath what that means by presence. And I think that's another area we should look at, particularly, I've heard this a lot with women. So here's what I found. I went to the coachee and said, what do you think is going on? And she said, well, Jane, when I'm in a meeting, there's a big table. And as you all know, in some very structured environments, somebody sitting at the front of the table might be the person in charge. And so she had a tendency to sit not even at the table, but in the very back of the room. Right there, that's kind of giving people a different idea. It was her natural style, nothing wrong with that. And then she would say things like this. She said, everybody was talking. And I would say, like, I'm sorry, but can I ask a question? And they would say, well, what is happening in the north of the Myanmar? And she'd go, I think we'll be okay. Yeah, Or what's happening with the rollout of this project for the logistics and supply chain? I'm not certain, but we'll find out. These three words were the ones that were impacting how she was viewed as a leader. Now, here's the problem. If we are going to be inclusive, then we have to appreciate leadership and communication style differences. We can't all of a sudden categorize. And what happened with this was it went from, oh, she's a humble servant leader, quiet, to I don't think she can do the job based on this. And this is where my role and all of our roles is not to change the person, but to get the senior leadership team to understand this is a valid leadership style. And she delivered the project and returned the project on time and everything was fine. But for them to kind of dial back their bias on what a leader looks like. The other part of this I think is critically important is she turned to me and she said, look, Jane, I was raised this way. I'm the youngest one on the team. I know that they hired me because they see I have potential, but I'm being deferential. I don't want to stand up and shout. It's not my natural style. If you tell me I have to do that, I will, but I feel uncomfortable. This is where I think that this is where inclusion is huge. And I think this is why we have to go with unconscious bias, is to get people to understand when we're making these categories or labeling people, how it can impact a career, how it can impact a project, right? And so this is, like I said, a lot of the work that I do, because I do see what happens is people get disengaged, they feel inadequate, they lose their confidence, and then they decide, maybe I don't need this, right? And so I think we have to learn to appreciate and move from understanding bias to how do we be inclusive? And so that's where I would love 2022 to go, and the IWD theme is to go breaking the bias and building inclusion. So let me just kind of ask you a few questions on this. In the recruitment and project selection, I see this all the time. I see people getting a resume, getting a person for a project and like looking through it quickly within 10 seconds and saying, yes, I really like that person. They'll be a great fit. That's That's actually bias in action. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to you again and Mentimeter and say, where have you seen bias impacting roles or project selection? And what I mean by that, anything, just throw it in there and Mentimeter if you'd like, and we can see some of the things coming up, and then we're going to kind of dial it back and to say, well, what do we do about it? At my workplace, if you could just elaborate a little bit more, maybe say the project, that would be really great so we could kind of see what's happening. Yeah, where have you seen bias impacting roles or selection? Consultant engagement, yes. Beneficiary selection during planning. Who gets what? Consultant engagement, that's a big one. Social services, community, right. Impacting pay, absolutely. Community. Georgia, community. Put that in there. Beneficiary selection, I think, is fascinating. Who would represent the organization? Absolutely. Who are we going to put? That was exactly like what happened in my Myanmar example. Should we have this person be representing us? Yes. Projects processing, government projects, hiring, training delivery. Yeah, either who is the facilitator or who we pick to do the training delivery. Maybe that's it. Yep. Within teams, tall men. Who put that within teams, tall men? That's so funny. There's research around height and bias, right? I think if whoever put that in, there is a ton of research around that we associate height with leadership. I just didn't put that into this this presentation. Who we pick to deliver trainings. Thanks, Nicole. Yep. And there's others on the chat, so I'm just going to call it. And who we pick to SME is very important. Pick to me, SME. Is that a subject matter expert? And I know the research and I have the experience. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, there's a lot of research on that, on height and leadership. And I think it goes back, kind of harkens back culture and before. Wonderful. This is absolutely wonderful. I think these are great. Now let's try to unpack this a little bit more. I have a few more questions that I want to get some interaction with you too, but I think this is wonderful. So I think, so I'm saying it's wonderful, but it really is impacting the bias, right? So I think what's good about it is it resonates with you, what I'm saying. So you're seeing the same thing that I'm seeing. So now it's up to us. It's like, well, what can we do about it? What are some things we can do? And I'm happy to share with you some of the things the work that I've been working on. I do really believe it's a switch to building inclusion and changing some behaviors around inclusion. I'm going to share those at the end with you. So let me just go back to the presentation and do a little bit more. Okay, so I think, one of those, before we just kind of wait to the end, one of those is, and it does take a little bit of courage, and I am going to appreciate power dynamics in the role of bias or hierarchical leadership, right? And I'm not saying like I said, one style of leadership is good or bad, but we have to have the courage to say, to question people, which as a consultant, I could do when I was in Myanmar, to say, look, this person is displaying all aspects of leadership. Just because she says this does not mean she's not delivering on the projects, right? Is she delivering? Yes, she's delivering. Is she getting a lot of great feedback when she goes out to the different areas of northern Myanmar? Yes. So, okay, so how much is that leadership, that communication style impacting her capability? And it got down to, it wasn't. And then they start to dial back, well, yes, she can do this project and we will move her up more inside the organization. So let's talk about typical bias. A typical bias is, you know, there's so much research done on unconscious bias from language and communication styles and words that are used across culture. Actually, before I go to typical bias, I do want to share with you my research on this, because I think it might resonate with you. So when I was interviewing women across, I'm just going to move this back. When I was interviewing women across the Asia Pacific and Middle East, I'm going to give you a framework of the type, to give you an idea who I'd interviewed. So it wasn't like, oh, the president of the ADB or the IMF or the World Bank or the head of the embassy. I would interview people in government organizations, multilateral banks, absolutely, academic institutions, also private and public sector, somebody who was leading had a global marketing role in Africa, then moved to China, all women born and raised in different countries in the Asia Pacific region. So they were leaders in their own rights, running big functions, having people underneath them. What was fascinating to me, and this is the thing with words across culture, is I would say to them, tell me about your leadership style. A very easy question, I thought. Every single one said, and I interviewed over 100 women. I'm a qualitative researcher. Every single one said, oh, I'm not a leader. I'm a coach. I'm a guide. I'm a facilitator. Now, this is fascinating because a lot of times in talent selection, we will say, well, who's a leader? Who wants to lead this, right? And the other thing was quantitative research in transformational leadership showed that women scored higher than men in coaching. So they were seen as higher skills in coaching than their male counterparts in transformational leadership. The other word that really got me, and this is probably showing my cultural bias of being an American, is I would say, you must have been very ambitious growing up to get where you are today. This word in Korea and Vietnam and parts of Singapore and parts of the Middle East was seen as negative, evil, and greedy. And they asked me not to use it. And honestly, you know, for me, it was just kind of a word that, you know, you're ambitious, right? Globally, this word for women has a stigma attached to it. So I did more research on it and found globally, if you're seen as too ambitious, it has a negative connotation. When I asked, what word would you prefer? Every single one said contribution. In the video they played, the ADB played in the very beginning of this session, they talked about what contribution women make. So I think there's a powerful distinction with words. The reason why I called this out, I've been in talent planning. I was the one who would sit in those meetings when we were selecting who was going to move forward. The two questions we asked, this is in the private sector, the two questions we ask is that person ambitious? And does that person want to lead? If that's not your natural style to say yes, what happens to your career? And if you don't have somebody in the room like me questioning those things, that's when you need to be able to highlight, we might have a biased approach to leadership. The last question I asked was my biggest mistake, which led to my greatest learning. I asked about failure. When I asked women in the Middle East, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, tell me about a time that you failed, I was met with complete silence for a very long time. They didn't answer the question. So what did I do? I repeated the question and asked it in a different way, or I slowed down the way I asked the question. And then, which was worse, is I started making associations. Oh, maybe they're not a leader. Oh, I don't really trust them. And I caught myself doing exactly what I saw happening in all the organizations I was working with. And so this is why I do the work that I do, because I think it's so, so important to share this and to be able to call ourselves on it. So that was my vulnerability in unconscious bias, being knee deep in it. And it happened in Japan, my first interview in Japan with that. So let's talk a little bit more about typical bias. So much work has been done on bias. There's 150 biases out there. You can, if you wanted to, you could take this chart and kind of read through them, but I think it would drive us all crazy. Halo bias, risk bias, mistake averse bias, this type of bias, that type of bias. You really don't need to know every single bias out there, but there were 3 that I found that were prevalent across every organization I've worked with. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about these and ask you if you've seen these before. The first one is confirmation bias. The second one is similarity bias. And the third one is distance bias. So let's break these down a little bit more, and I'll share with you what I uncovered in these areas. I'm going to tell a story around them, so to make it clear, and link it back to neuroscience too. So the first one was confirmation bias. And this one's a little bit funny for any of you that live in Manila or the Philippines. So I was working with, again, another embassy down there. And they asked me if I could help them figure out how to be more diverse in their recruitment strategy, right? So I said, okay, yeah, let's take a look at where you're recruiting from. Let's look at the universities that you're recruiting from. And they said, oh, well, we only recruit from the University of the Philippines. It's the best. And everybody that comes out of that university is really, really smart. They're the best. And if you look at my team and my whole group, they're all from the University of Manila. There's nothing wrong with the University of Manila. What's wrong with that strategy is it's not diverse, right? And then they would say, look, but they're all smart and my team's really smart and this is what we're doing. So I stopped at that moment and said, you see what you're doing, aren't you? You're taking one piece of information and you're using that one piece of evidence that you find convincing to confirm why you do what you do. This is confirmation bias. Honestly, if I'm going to go out on a limb here, but if any of you started peeling back your recruitment strategies of where you get people from, or even your talent strategies and promotion strategies, you might find you have a bit of confirmation bias there. I've also worked with investment banks that only recruit from the top tier universities around the world. And they use the same strategy. We can't deviate from Beida or University of Tokyo, or University, whatever university it is. We can only recruit from there. This is when you get group thinking. This is when you don't get the diversity that you need. So that's a typical one that happens. The other one that happens that I think you might also resonate with, this is natural for all of us. It's called similarity bias. Now, this one is quite interesting because it is part of our brain. When I meet somebody new, when you meet somebody new, we're going to find out everything we can about them. And then we're going to start trying to find things that we do the same. Like it could be maybe I spent a lot of time in Uzbekistan, or my grandparents, my mom's from Uzbekistan, and she makes the best mantis, the best stuffed meat dumplings. And I'm interviewing somebody who's from Uzbekistan, and she says, yes, my mom makes the best, mantis, stuffed dumplings. Like, oh, let's change recipes. Let's talk about the food. Let's talk about where we'd like to go to dinner. All of that starts a conversation, right? It could be around food, where you went to school. Oh, I like to do creative thinking. I like to read murder mysteries. I like this, I like that. Then you feel more comfortable with the person you're bringing on your team or you're interviewing. Nothing wrong with that. It actually is what we naturally do. But what happens is if somebody else comes on the team and they're completely different than you, maybe they don't like stuffed dumplings, you might discount them, right? You might perceive the one person more positively than the other person. And I want to call this out here as this is not negative. Like we're not trying, it's just that we don't realize we're doing it. And so this is similarity bias. Take this back to gender, right? Take this back to working in multicultural environments. You can see where this plays out inside organizations. Why do we need assessment tools sometimes to bring very diverse people on our team so we can get the rich thinking? So this is some similarity bias. And this is why I like to highlight that bias is not good or bad, it just is. Next piece, distance bias. Distance bias is one that I have found happens across probably all the organizations that are sitting here, whether it be the Asian Development Bank or government ministries in Uzbekistan or Pakistan or Tajikistan, all of the ministries, you have people spread out all over, right? So if I'll just use the ADB because I'm familiar with the ADB, having been there a while. So if I'm at the ADB and I'm running, the legal function or compliance function or whatever function, but I have teams and missions all around the stands, all around Asia, all over. But I might have a lawyer who works with me who I just give things to. That's my go-to person. Close is better than far. And I may forget about the person in Uzbekistan or forget about the person who's in Mongolia. Yeah, they're there and they're really great, but I start giving all the work and the opportunities and I started introducing the person who's close by me. This also happens on Zoom. It's not just because it's not distances. I mean, just because we're in the same meeting, it could be we keep calling on somebody that we know on Zoom, right? What happens with that is the team around doesn't get opportunities, doesn't get exposure, doesn't get visibility, starts to feel maybe disengaged, starts to feel excluded. So this is where the inclusion, belonging, excluded comes in. And worse, when my boss says to me, or the DG says to me, Jane, who do you think is your high potential talent, or who should we give this mission to? Who am I going to name? My go-to person, right? So I wanted to explain these three pieces to you because they're really, really common at work, really easy to break, but it's something we might not even realize we're doing. The distance one is one that I have worked with a lot of organizations, and particularly on talent planning. And after going through this, they realized that every person they thought was a high potential talent was their go-to person. And they went back and rethought about it. And then you got the rich diversity in the talent planning process. So what I want to do now is ask you a question. Again, this is our Mentimeter time. Does bias, now that you know everything about bias, right? Well, a lot about bias, I'm saying everything about bias. Does bias play a role in the current issues of gender inclusion and empowerment? If we think about this from a gender inclusion perspective, does bias play a role? Oh, love that. I like the poll. So let's let this kind of go a little bit. And also it'd be good to know, and maybe if you could put in chat, now that we have this as a poll, it would be good to know, maybe. Thank you for that. I don't know. Good. Great. I love that, because we might not know, right? If we could put into chat, how do you see it playing out? How does it impact empowerment? That would be really great, because I think you can only do the poll for this one, but in chat, it would be really helpful. Not given higher positions to women. Yeah, both not given higher positions to women. And yep. Impacts who gets support or project. Absolutely. And this could be, if you could name it, would it be similarity bias, confirmation bias? Like we've got 15 people saying yes. Thinking of women or PWDs minorities would not be capable of managing projects. Okay, great. Thank you for that, Dr. Nabila Shahid. Thinking that, and then, yeah, thinking that one cannot do the project without help alone. Similarity, I guess, yeah. So I like this person, let me give them that project. I know they'll get it done. Yeah, could be, right? Absolutely. Yeah. These are great. It's confirmation, similarity bias, Javira. Yep. Yeah. So confirmation, majority of decisions are male, not familiar with the challenges and experience of female. Yep. So that actually is a really, that's a really good point for Rita. And I'm just going to make an assumption here when you say that, are the majority of decisions made by men? And if they're made by the men, how do we now start to get them to see from a female perspective on how we make decisions? I think that's a really good point. Still reproductive domain, consider women, okay, still seeing primary places at home maybe, and not capable or making some judgments on that. Female engineers don't get appreciation. That's and we need more female engineers. Productive domain is meant for men only. Wow. Well, these are hardcore statements. In many cases, women are expected to define such things, and all of the above of these is because of bias. Yep. So if I see the responses that you've created, let me just see if I can sum it up for you. We can keep, by all means, keep putting this in here. It feels like there's some preconceived notions about roles. Men do this, women do this. Men make, in some areas, I'm not saying all, some men make decisions and perhaps don't take in another perspective, perhaps is not inclusive of a woman's perspective, right? And then this in effect impacts empowerment, right? Impacts women end up doing unpaid traditional work and vulnerable work. Yeah. And then that USMA, that in itself leads to what we saw happening with COVID, right? So these roles that were perhaps unpaid or traditional or vulnerable work were how COVID impacted women, more women than men in some of the countries. Traditional work roles for men and women. So yeah, you're right. This is, so these, Charmin, these ideas, if that's how we see these traditional roles, then these do play out inside our organizations for making decisions about who gets what project. Yeah. And then think about that with your community that you're serving. If we make decisions based on one perspective, but we don't take 50% of the population's perspective, how do we know we're serving this community well? How do we know we're delivering on what we should be delivering? So I think it's all quite convoluted and it comes together. Really, thank you so much for this. This is fabulous. I really appreciate the dialogue. It's so nice to have this dialogue on Zoom. We've been working on Zoom for so long, we think we can't do this. I want to now shift us a little bit to say, well, what can we do, right? Let's talk a little bit about that, and then give you enough time to do some reflection on what are you taking away from this session, or what are you learning from it? So, so to sum up, it feels like we've got some preconceived notions about who can do what type of work who's responsible for what. We might also see, you know, give certain roles to certain people, maybe not give projects to certain people because we have a preconceived notion on it. So let's talk about why inclusion matters and why we're going down this path and even concerned about it, and what are the opportunities for change. There's a beautiful piece of research that was completed, it was about 10 years ago, and it's with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Carnegie Mellon. And what was fascinating about this project, and there's a Harvard Business Review, and I can send it to Marcella and the ADB. It's actually definitely worth reading, particularly for those of you who, some of the responses about people not including 50% of the population's thoughts on work, right? So what the researchers were looking at is how do we get these great teams? What makes a team? Is it individual smartness? Is it the makeup of the team? What is it? And teams have been studied for many, many years, so it wasn't really anything new. But what was new is they were not looking for gender. What was incredibly powerful is they did find that gender made a difference. And of course it was having more women on the team. I think it was, 3 or more on the team or whatever, but that just wasn't it. We always talk about, let's have 30% women on boards or so many women in leadership, pardon me. It was actually that when they watched these collaborative virtual teams, and isn't that what we're doing right now? Collaborative virtual teams, is they found that it was the equal play of give and take of the conversation. It wasn't that one group spoke over the other or one group captured the conversation more. It was just this equal collaborative process that was incredibly powerful. The other part of that was that they found that women, more than men, had they pulled out one characteristic of women on the team, and that they called it social sensitivity. And what that meant was that women could read the nonverbal cues of what was going on at that meeting. So for example, if somebody was kind of quiet and a deep thinker, they would call them in. Oh, Miriam, tell me a little bit more about that. Oh, Marcella, I noticed that you might not have understood that comment we made. Can you share a little bit more? So being able to reach out and kind of seeing the nuances of nonverbal cues. So what happened in this study was, I think the studies, want a better team, add women. What happened in this study was that they had, women had a huge significance on better decisions, better problem solving, and more innovative ideas. If we think of all of us here, look at what's happening here. Look at the collaboration here. I mean, sadly, we're not opening up to talk back 1 to 4th, but you could use this exact example at your work. You all have virtual collaborations. You all have meetings. We all need decisions to be made. We need better ideas. So being able to be inclusive drives this, and listening to all voices drives this collective intelligence. So that's one reason for it. And I think it's a reason that almost every single person sitting on this Zoom session can identify with. And it's a fabulous piece of research that, for those that need convincing, can go back and read this article. The next piece goes back to neuroscience, and it goes back to being excluded. And it's a very important piece of research that I wanted to call out to all of you, whether you're leading a team or not leading a team. But this was a few years ago. And let's think about this, as we join an organization or as we join a team, we start off wanting to know, well, where's my desk? Where's my Zoom? Where's my computer, right? So I need to make certain everything is set up for me. Then safety. I'm okay to talk here. I get my paycheck, you know, it's about compensation. I get water, I get food, I know where things are. And the third one is belonging, having a sense of belonging. And so scientists felt that we would walk through this sort of slowly, right? When I first start my job, safety, physiological and safety is important to me. Then I'll maybe a few more months or 3 months or 6 months, I'll feel like I have a sense of belonging. And then the esteem part is, after about 6 months where people really listen to me when I'm doing my project and they listen to my reports. And then the fourth one is, oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here because the work that I'm doing is very much aligned with my values. And that might take longer for me to realize that. What the research has found is something completely different. And I say this because it talks about exclusion. And I say this because it's really important for your teams if you're doing work or project or when you're bringing new people into the organization. People want this sense of belonging the first day. If I am excluded from a project, so there was a piece of research that was done and they looked at MRIs of people who felt excluded, and the pain that that person felt is the same pain as breaking an arm. In their brains, they could see a shift, how much pain that caused them. Now, let's just take this one step further. When you are excluded to go out to a mission, or you are excluded to help with a project, or you're not listened to when you have a great idea, or we're not going to take your decision because we have these gender roles in our head. This impacts engagement. This impacts showing up for work. This impacts doing the best that you can do. There's a whole array of area that this impacts. And I thought what I thought was really powerful is the neuroscience behind it, that it is the pain that people feel when they are excluded. So I wanted to drive that point home because one is collective intelligence that gives us better ideas. The second point is a sense of belonging that helps us show up at work and be the best we can and be our authentic self. And understanding that when we do that to people, what happens to them. So talked a lot about bias. You shared a lot on what's going on in your world, where you saw similarity bias, confirmation bias, maybe some mental frameworks that need to change or mental models that need to shift a little bit inside your organizations. So what can we do about this? Like, okay, Jane, you've presented a lot of interesting insights, I hope, but I don't want to leave on a down note. And I also want to say that we're all in charge of this. We can't say, one of the best quotes on bias is, oh, it's them, it's not us. But guess what? It is us. And I hope that you got that from me with my research in Japan and across Asia. So if you want to today, this is, if you want to see if anybody in your team, whether that be a consultant, whether that be a contract staff, whether that be somebody just newly joined, you can ask them 3 questions. These are research-based in question out of 100 questions on inclusion. They're really, really simple questions to ask. And you know what? You can even ask yourself these questions. And the first is, do I feel like I belong here? Now, if somebody says, if you ask that question and somebody says no, your response is, how can I help? How can I help you with that? What can I do to make a difference for you? So, you know, obviously, and that actually extends the leadership part of your role. The other one is, can I voice a contrary views and be heard? If I've got something else to say, challenge a leader, question a leader on a policy, question how we're rolling out mentoring, question how we're doing supply chain, or what suppliers we're using, or what contractors we're using, will I be heard? And will I be labeled, oh, too aggressive, right? So can my contrary views be heard? The third one is, are perspectives like mine part of the decision-making process? This one is critical. This one actually gives the inclusion part up, down, across the organization. And if you don't, this is actually the essence of inclusion. We always talk about, oh, we need, so many percentage of this group at the top or this group here. This is the essence of inclusion, up, down, and across the organization, if everybody's perspective is part of the decision-making process. It takes a little bit of time, but it's something we need to consider. So now comes to the bias part. How do we mitigate bias? So in the beginning, if we go back to your words on the slide, I hope that I have demonstrated to you that bias is both positive and negative. The negative side is when we pick one group over another. It happens out of our control, right? So what we don't want to do is probably say to somebody, oh, you're biased, because that's a little too strong and we might not even realize we are. But let's talk about what we can do when we see bias in action. Let's talk about it from our own perspective, and let's talk about it from maybe somebody we're working with that we're thinking, was that the most well thought out decision? And even if that person is in a position of power. So I want to tell you that you can never get rid of bias. You can only mitigate it or manage it. And we're going to do it in a few simple ways. The first is you need to know your triggers, right? You need to understand if I say, oh, we have to hire this person, they'll be perfect for the ADV. I just know that. I just know. I can ask myself, well, where am I getting that data from? Or somebody else can say to me, Jane, what data are you using to make that decision? Marcella actually said something this morning that really got to me. She said, we need to come together to kind of at the very beginning of our session today, you need to come together to work on these decisions. The best way to mitigate bias is to come together and to question one another, question ourselves, where's the data that I'm making this decision from? Or have somebody say to me, Jane, what data are you using that you think that person is the best person to hire for this project? Where is this coming from? The second one is to slow down your decision making. And that's the reason why I use the funny pictures and the slide that made no sense, because I gave you a system 1 question. Answer this question in 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 10 seconds. But what we need to do is slow down our decision making. When we pull on systems 2, it's our rational, logical thinking with empathy. If you want to build an inclusive organization, you have to use system 2 and empathy. Third one is listen with palpable respect. And you're probably thinking, oh yeah, I've heard this 1,000 times before. But guess what? Most of us listen 20 seconds. That was research 3 years ago. Research last year said most of us spend 11 seconds listening. If we don't listen to the ideas around us, what are we missing? So take time to listen, and with respect, and don't try to listen to respond. Listen to where their story's going. The fourth one is give others time to think and respond. This goes back to my person I was working with in Myanmar. She had wonderful ideas. She was a deep thinker. It took a little bit of time, but when she spoke, her ideas were incredible. Give people time to think and give them time to respond. These are 4 really simple steps that you can do to be able to mitigate bias. I now want you to remember, of all the things I said today, is this simple principle. People first principle. Take off men, take off women, take off cultures, take off aggressive speaker, assertive speaker, all of that, quiet, reserve. just look at the person in front of you and use a people first principle. This is where we're headed in diversity, equity, inclusion, is to go towards a non-category world. Look at the richness, look at the strengths, look at the capabilities that women are bringing into the organization, and let's multiply that. Let's look at that person first and don't look at gender and say, bring them in and give them projects, and let's encourage the strengths that women bring to the organization and your communities. As we wind down, and I've given you so much information, what I'd really love to do is to use Mentimeter for the last time. And I only have one request for you. What I'd love for you to do is put one word, whatever that one word is that you're walking away with, like, this really hit me, or one learning I learned, whatever that is, put that into Mentimeter so we can have a really beautiful visual of one word learning. When you share your learning, it triggers a thought for somebody else. So please, please use Mentimeter and let us know what your one word learning. Oh, I love that somebody put people first. That's actually the future of diversity, equity, inclusion, is a people first principle. Nice. Patience. Yes. Perception. Tamar, thank you. We're going to give this some time, so just keep thinking and keep posting it, because I think it would be, once you share other people, it triggers other people's thinking. And this is actually collective. This is collectively mitigating bias and collective learning and collective intelligence all in one slide. So thank you so much for this. Think big. I love that. Clarity, triggers, openness, power. Yes. Meaning of bias. Give others equal time. Observation. People hurt by exclusion. Yeah, that was a really powerful piece of research. People are definitely hurt by exclusion. Thank you so much. Please keep them coming. Not making quick decisions. Absolutely. I'm just going to read this out. As far as gender bias is concerned, it is important to understand the gender situation using facts and data to mitigate one's gender bias. Knowledge of the situation and oneself is key to mitigate. Absolutely, Alice. Thank you for that. Very interesting session. Oh, thank you. The professional individual approach, give others equal time to think and respond, time to think, don't react instead of mindfully respond. Thank you, Zara. Nice to see you again too. Thank you, Nino. Oh my gosh, so nice. Oh, I'm so glad Zahida inspired you to do something different. I think we should all be inspired to take time to listen and respond, and also challenge one another. I don't mean challenge in a aggressive way, but challenge to question, to say, tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking when you say we should hire this person or this person for this project. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it. You're all wonderful. Let's just collectively, let's drive change and build inclusion for 2022. Thank you. Marcella, do I hand it over to you now?
Yes, can do. Thank you so much, Jane. I think when we were looking, maybe we just pop up the Mentimeter one more time. I think I like all the comments coming through. I really enjoyed the workshop, and you and I have done this a number of times, but I love the sharing on the neuroscience, the understanding how that impacts us as individuals, how it impacts us as managers, as bosses, as in our wider circle, whether that's in our professional space, whether that's in our social or family space. And I love the people first principle, because that's the whole point. Yesterday, we discussed the challenges and some of the opportunities and some of the approaches that are helping to alleviate the challenges. But today is really about us as humans, us as individuals. It starts with us. It doesn't matter what our title is, what country we're from, what we're doing, what we're struggling with, or what we've achieved, but it's about us and our interactions with individuals. My interaction with you is different from my interaction with Mohammed here. And so it's about back to that human connection so that we can be more inclusive. So thank you very much, Jane. I see more comments coming through. Have really, really enjoyed that. And I'm hoping that some of these things, we've left some golden nuggets, right?
Yep.
There are different parts in the workshop where we'll say, actually, that's a good point. You had some questions on what questions can I ask to be more inclusive? What questions can I ask myself when I'm that decision maker? Because this room is full of decision makers.
Yeah,
How
absolutely.
are we being more inclusive in how we support the women that need our help, and how we include these women as we're making decisions and designing? We're effectively at a point where we are designing the post-COVID world. I know that sounds awfully apocalyptic, but we all can contribute to that. And I think you've left us with some great tools and questions to be able to just make micro changes. We're not asking people to change, but micro changes so that our projects can be more impactful and more inclusive.
Yeah,
So,
no, thank you. It was fab. I loved all the interaction. I just want to thank the participants so much. It was just, I love the giggles too. Like some of the comments were so funny. So thank you for that.
very nice, very nice. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jane. What I'd like to do now is actually hand it over to Maya Schmidt. You'll remember her from yesterday. She presented to us a very interesting visual summary of what we have heard and learned today. Maya, can I hand it over to you?
Sure thing. Thank you, Marcella. Let me just share my screen. So, yeah, so a lot of discussion yesterday and today. So I'll start off with the recap of the deep dive discussions from day one. So under livelihoods and work, some Uzbekistan projects that came out was capacity building of financial services and digital financial literacy programs for women, creating supply chain and logistics support for women-owned SMEs. Under the Kyrgyz Republic, they're doing like mentorship programs for women entrepreneurs and using social media to inspire women. It's also important to have inclusion of vulnerable groups as a cross-cutting approach. Under PAK project, access to higher skilled and non-traditional areas is needed. For unpaid care and domestic work, advanced legislation and raising public awareness is needed. There was gendered evidence generation and implication to policies, supportive mechanisms for vulnerable groups of women, and intensive support to education of women and girls. Under gender-based violence and health services for victims of gender-based violence, mobile groups to provide comprehensive assistance was done in Kyrgyz Republic, as well as hotlines with psychological support and referral to relevant law enforcement. The private sector can play a role in women's empowerment in terms of raising awareness to a wider audience and leadership skills training. And awareness raising and investment projects is another thing. Then we moved on to unconscious gender bias presented by Jane. So we learned that bias is something that we're unaware of. It's outside of our control, and that quick judgments often lead to blind spots. We're often influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences. And the role that bias plays is shown in this drawing. So our brain consists of two systems. The first system being one where we make automatic associations, where we're impulsive and where we stereotype. In system two, it's our side where we're more empathetic, we're more conscious and logical. We need bias to make decisions, and we need it to make meaning of the world, for efficiency when we make decisions, and for our survival. And impact at work, leadership communication is the biggest challenge, but it's also an opportunity. So under leadership styles, Jane brought up her Myanmar embassy case study, where they hired someone who was described as a humble servant leader, but based on how she communicated, they started doubting her ability to get the job done. Her leadership style is valid, and we need to move from understanding bias to being more inclusive. And in terms of recruitment biases, there's confirmation, which is using one piece of information to justify an action. Similarity, which is perceiving people like you more positively, and distance, whereby you give opportunities to people you are closer to. And then why inclusion matters is like we have collective intelligence, and it's good to have purpose, esteem, safety, belonging, and physiological stuff. And 3 questions for building inclusion is, do I feel like I belong here? Because exclusion can be a great source of pain. Can I voice contrary views and be heard? And are perspectives like mine part of decision making? And ways that you can mitigate bias is knowing your triggers, slowing down, listening with respect, giving others time to think and respond, and putting people first. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. It was an honor to draw the summaries for the past 2 days. Back to you, Marcella.
Thank you so much, Maya. And we will be sharing that for everyone's reference as well. So really, yesterday we started with a study looking at the gender impacts of COVID-19 across Central and West Asia. We saw that there's both common challenges as well as localized and country-specific challenges and approaches to these challenges. We were privileged to gain insights from our panel speakers with perspectives from government, private sector, CSOs, and the ADB, of course. In our deep dive discussions, you shared your experiences on the impactful approaches you've seen be successful in addressing these issues. And today we looked at unconscious bias, something that impacts all of our projects and programs. We learned we're all biased. Sometimes we use it for good, sometimes not so good. We learned that we're both part of the problem for gender bias, but we also learned that we can be part of the solution. And we hope that you can take these learnings for your own self-reflection, and that you'll find that these learnings you can share with your teams and your departments as you reflect on your current and upcoming gender-related programs. To close today, I would like to invite our last speaker. It's an honor to introduce Shani Campbell. Shani has 26 years of experience in 26 countries in the transport, energy, agriculture, water resources, and financial sectors. She is now the country director for Tajikistan Resident Mission. Thank you so much for joining us, Shani. May I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Marcella. It's really my pleasure. Well, first of all, happy Women's Month, everyone. As we end this really highly productive 2-day workshop organized by the Central and West Asia Department of ADB, I'd like to express our deepest appreciation to all of the partners who participated, especially those who stayed on right to the end of this workshop. But having caught the last couple of hours myself, I can certainly see why you did. It seemed like you were all extremely engaged, and the subject matter was very, very interesting. I guess the presentations and the discussions have indeed been guided by our Director General's message of promoting inclusivity and ensuring that no one's left behind, especially women and other vulnerable groups, in our development and developmental goals, and in our operations as we face a post-COVID future. The presentation on the ongoing study, Gendered Impacts of the COVID-19 in Central and West Asia, Opportunities and Lessons for Gender Responsive Public Investments. We like to have long and complicated titles in ADB. And the discussions that followed it have not only analysed the devastating impacts of the pandemic on our countries more broadly, and importantly on women, but also examined opportunities and effective approaches to address the gendered impacts of the crisis we're all facing. We all heard about increasing violence against women and girls, the toll of unpaid care and domestic work, which weighs heavily on women, and the loss of jobs and income for women, among other gendered impacts in the current global crisis. ADB has tried to be at the forefront of going beyond the gender mainstreaming work which we have been accustomed to through the pandemic. Through the COVID responsive projects, we have effectively promoted the Gender Transformative Agenda, even as we confronted the operational challenges that the pandemic's brought our way. For this, we're very thankful to the support of ADB's partners in the region. As we move towards what we're now calling the new normal, don't you hate that term, we're also called upon to stay cognizant that the systematic gender disparities and gender biases that we all have to will always remain as stumbling blocks unless they remain unheeded in our development initiatives. I also wanted to add that we've moved through the pandemic now, but many of us now face an economic crisis as the result of current regional turmoil. There'll be many vectors of impact, from exchange rates to food prices to impacts on employment. And I really encourage all of you to develop solutions using a gender lens and with reference to our own biases. Overall, the discussions within the two-day workshop are ripe with insightful ideas and examples of an enabling policy environment, effective strategies for promoting women's economic empowerment, and recommendations to enhance women and girls' access to social services, amongst others. May we be inspired with these impactful approaches and planning for our future projects and programs in our respective countries. Again, thank you to all the representations of various government agencies in our partner countries in Central and West Asia operations, representatives from CSOs, the private sector, development partners, and ADB staff and consultants. I wish you all have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shani. If I could just ask you to stay on one more minute, we'd love to take a group photo. This is the moment we've all been waiting for. If you are still with us, please turn on your camera for just a minute. We'd love to get a group shot here.
Okay, I'll be taking the group photo. We have 4 pages, so please bear with me. Okay, I'll take the photo now. 1, 2, 3. Next page. 1, 2, 3. And then third page. 1, 2, 3. And then last page. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Tony. At this point, we have come to the end of our two-day workshop, Investing in Women. We've heard lots of interesting things, but really, I'd like to just end with saying these workshops are only as successful as the participants and their participation and contribution. So I would like to thank all of you for your input, for your insights, for your questions, for your giggles, and for your comments and feedback. We would love if you could just spare us one more minute. We would like to get your feedback so that we can continue to improve our workshops. There's a link here. The link has been popped into the chat box as well, and I believe it will be included in the wrap-up email that should come out in the next few days. All event materials for the workshop, including the agenda, the presentations, both in English and in Russian, the recordings from yesterday and today, and other event-related materials will be shared on the event page. The link has been included in the chat box as well. With that, thank you very much again. and have a wonderful day.